3 in the afternoon, a hill outside the walls of Jerusalem. A man who has been beaten, mocked, and nailed to a Roman cross lifts his head, and out of a body that is failing, he speaks. Not a prayer anyone expected, not a blessing, not a curse on the soldiers below. He says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The crowd goes quiet. Some of them think he's calling for Elijah. Others say nothing at all. And for 2,000 years, those words have been read as the sound of a man at the end of everything. Abandonment, despair, the final collapse of hope. But there is something about that sentence that most people never notice. It wasn't original. Those words already existed. They had been written down, copied, sung, and preserved for roughly 1,000 years before that afternoon. They were the opening line of a poem that goes on to describe a man surrounded by mockers, with his hands and feet destroyed, his bones out of joint, his throat dry as clay, watching strangers divide his clothing and gamble for the last thing he owns. And that poem was finished centuries before the Roman Empire existed. So here is the question this video is going to follow, all the way to the bottom. Why those words? Of everything a dying man could say, why did Jesus reach back 1,000 years and pull out the first line of an ancient Hebrew song? Was he simply crying out in pain, using the only language grief had left him? Or was he doing something else entirely? Pointing every person standing beneath that cross toward a text they already knew by heart and had never once understood. Before we go further, if you're the kind of person who reads scripture and senses there's more underneath it than you were ever taught, subscribe. This channel exists for exactly that kind of mind. It takes 2 seconds, and it tells me to keep making these. Now let's go back, not to the cross, not yet. Let's go back 1,000 years to a man sitting somewhere in the hill country of Israel, writing words he would never see fulfilled. To understand what happened on that hill, you have to understand what was already written. The poem is called Psalm 22. In our Bibles, it sits quietly between 2 of the most famous chapters in all of Scripture. Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd." Psalm 24, "The earth is the Lord's and everything in it." Millions of people can recite those from memory. Psalm 22 is the one right before, and most people skip it. The Hebrew text carries a superscription attributing it to David, the shepherd who became a king. Scholars debate the dating of individual psalms, and some argue the collection took its final form over centuries. But the traditional attribution places this song roughly 1,000 years before the events described in the Gospels, and here is the part that matters more than the debate. We have physical proof the text existed long before the crucifixion. Copies of the Psalms were found among the Dead and Sea Scrolls in the caves near Qumran. Manuscripts written before Jesus was born. Before that, the Psalms had already been translated into Greek in Alexandria in the centuries before the Roman occupation. Whatever you believe about who wrote it, nobody seriously argues that Psalm 22 was composed after the crucifixion. The text came first. That much is not in dispute. So who was David, and why was he writing something like this? Forget the stained glass. Forget the golden crown. David spent years as a hunted man, living in caves, sleeping in the wilderness of Judah. A king had put a price on his head and sent armies after him. His own son later led a rebellion against him. He was betrayed by advisors he trusted. He lost a child. He made catastrophic mistakes and then had to live inside the wreckage of them. David knew what it felt like to pray into silence And that's how the poem starts. Not with worship, not with confidence, with a man screaming at heaven and hearing nothing come back. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish? My God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer by night, but I find no rest. Well, read that slowly. There is no polish on it, no theological cushion. The Bible, a book people accuse of being propaganda for God, opens one of its own songs with an accusation against God. It doesn't sanitize the cry, it preserves it. That alone should stop you. But that's not the strange part. The strange part comes a few lines later, because the poem shifts. It stops sounding like the private diary of an ancient king and starts describing something very specific. A scene, almost a report. All who see me mock me. They hurl insults, shaking their heads. He trusts in the Lord, they say. Let the Lord rescue him. Let him deliver him, since he delights in him. Now hold that image in your mind, not the crucifixion, not yet. Stay in the ancient world. Picture a man surrounded by people who aren't just hurting him. They're performing. They're taunting him with his own faith, turning his trust in God into the punchline. That is a very particular kind of cruelty. It isn't generic suffering, it's theological mockery. And you would expect a detail that specific to belong to one man in one moment, in one century. But then the psalm says something stranger. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart has turned to wax, it has melted within me. My mouth is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. Bones pulled out of joint, a body poured out, a mouth so dry it feels like broken pottery. Now, poetry uses exaggeration. Every ancient culture had a vocabulary for describing misery, and Hebrew poetry is full of vivid physical metaphor. A careful reader has to say that plainly. This could be a man describing dehydration, terror, illness, exhaustion. It could be. But keep reading, because the next line is the one that has caused arguments for 2,000 years. Dogs surround me, a pack of villains encircles me, they pierce my hands and my feet. Stop there. I want to be honest with you about this verse, because I'd rather you trust me than be impressed by me. There is a genuine textual debate here. The standard Hebrew text that came down through the medieval Jewish scribal tradition reads a word that looks like ka'ari, which means like a lion. Under that reading, the line says something closer to, like a lion, my hands and my feet. Many Jewish translations render it that way, and they are not being dishonest when they do, but that's not the whole picture. The Greek translation of the Psalms, made by Jewish scholars in Egypt, centuries before Christianity existed, renders that word as they dug, or they pierced. So the piercing reading is not a Christian invention, it predates Christianity entirely. And in the 20th century, in a cave at Nahal Herver, near the Dead Sea, archaeologists found a fragment of a psalm scroll older than the medieval Hebrew manuscripts. In that fragment, the word appears with a final letter that supports the verb reading. They have dug or pierced, rather than lion. Scholars still argue about it. That argument is real, and I'm not going to pretend it's settled. But here is what nobody can argue about. An ancient Hebrew poem, written and copied long before Rome ever crucified anyone in Judea, contains a line about hands and feet being destroyed. In a song about a righteous man surrounded by enemies who mock his faith in God. And crucifixion, as Rome practiced it, did not exist in David's world. Israel executed people by stoning, the Roman cross, the nails, the exposure, the public spectacle, was still centuries away from the man who wrote those words. So what exactly was he describing? That detail would not have meant much to anyone reading it for the next 1,000 years, until one afternoon outside Jerusalem, when it suddenly meant everything. And here is where the story becomes difficult to dismiss, because we're not looking at one similarity anymore. Let's keep going, because the next detail is the one that historians find hardest to explain away. I can count all my bones. People stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them and cast lots for my clothing. Read that again. The sufferer is not only in pain, he is exposed, stripped, on display. People are looking at him, not with pity, but with fascination. And while he is still conscious, still watching, the men standing over him are handling his clothes and gambling for them. Think about what that requires. For someone to divide your clothing while you are still alive, you have to be unable to stop them. You have to be immobilized, restrained, publicly. And your death has to be slow enough that there's time to kill by playing a game. That is not how ancient Israel executed people. The stoning was fast and it was communal. There was no waiting around. But it is an almost clinical description of a Roman execution detail at work. Soldiers assigned indeed to a crucifixion, waiting out the hours, dividing the condemned man's possessions as a customary perk of the job. Now here's the gospel side. All 4 gospel accounts mention the division of Jesus' clothing. John's account is the most specific. The soldiers split the garments 4 ways, but the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece, so rather than tear it, they cast lots for it. John then explicitly quotes Psalm 22, and this is exactly where a fair-minded person should raise a hand and ask the obvious question. Isn't that circular? If the Gospel writers knew Psalm 22, and they absolutely did, every literate Jew of the period knew the Psalms. Couldn't they have simply written their account to match it? Couldn't the details have been reverse engineered? That's a serious objection, and it deserves a serious answer. Here's the honest one. Nobody can hand you a video recording from the year 33. What we have are documents, and the strength of a claim like this doesn't come from any single detail. It comes from whether the pattern holds together under pressure. So consider a few things. The Gospel writers were not shy about telling you when they thought a prophecy was being fulfilled. John does it openly with the garments. Matthew does it repeatedly. If the intention were pure fabrication, you'd expect them to point at every connection and hammer it. But they don't. Several of the strongest parallels in Psalm 22 sit there in the crucifixion narratives with no comment at all. The writers never mention them. They seem not to have noticed. The most striking example of that is the mockery. Matthew records that the people passing by hurled insults at Jesus and shook their heads. Then he records the religious leaders saying, essentially, he trusts in God. Let God rescue him now if he wants him. Compare that to what David wrote 1,000 years earlier. They hurl insults, shaking their heads, saying, he trusts in the Lord. Let the Lord rescue him. Not a similar theme, not a general resemblance. The same gesture and the same taunt in the same order. And Matthew doesn't stop the narrative to point it out. He just reports it. Now, could a writer have inserted that deliberately? Yes. That possibility is on the table, and I'm not going to remove it for you. But notice what you're being asked to believe if you go that route. You have to believe that multiple authors, writing in different places for different communities, independently constructed a scene around an obscure psalm, and then several of them declined to take credit for it. One detail can be coincidence. 2 details can still be debated. But at some point you have to stop and ask, how many of these does it take before coincidence is doing more work than the alternative? Because there's more. The psalm says, "Oh, my strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth." John records that Jesus near the end said, "I thirst." The psalm says, "I am a worm and not a man, scorned by everyone, despised by the people." The Gospels describe a public humiliation so complete that a man with a following in the thousands died with almost no one willing to stand near him. The psalm describes enemies encircling the sufferer, closing in, staring. The Gospels describe soldiers, chief priests, elders, and a crowd. Layers of people surrounding a man who cannot move. The psalm describes bones out of joint and a body poured out like water. Modern medical analyses of crucifixion, and there are several published in mainstream journals, describe a mechanism of death involving progressive asphyxiation, the arms bearing the body's full weight, joints under sustained dislocating strain, and severe fluid loss. The man who wrote Psalm 22 had never seen that. He could not have. The method didn't exist yet in his world. And still, this is the part I keep coming back to. The poem is not written as a prediction. That's what makes it strange. Prophecy in the ancient world usually announces itself. Thus says the Lord, "In that day, behold, the days are coming." The prophetic books are full of that language. Isaiah uses it, Jeremiah uses it, Ezekiel uses it. Psalm 22 does none of that. It never says this will happen. It never addresses the future. It is written entirely in the present and past tense by a man describing what is happening to him right now in his own life. It reads like a diary entry, not a forecast, and that raises a question that I think is more interesting than the one we started with. If this poem is not trying to predict anything, why does it describe something so specific? There are, broadly, three ways people answer that. The first is that it's coincidence layered on selective reading, that we're finding faces in clouds, taking a poem full of standard ancient suffering imagery and matching it to a story we already know the ending of. This is the skeptical position, and it's not stupid. Human beings are pattern-finding machines. We do this constantly, and we're often wrong. The second is literary dependence, that the gospel writers shaped their accounts around the psalm on purpose, as theological interpretation rather than reportage. The third is the one Christians have held for 2,000 years, that David wrote his own suffering, truthfully, out of his own life, and that in doing so he was describing something larger than himself without fully knowing it. That the pattern was in the text before anyone could recognize it, waiting. I'm not going to tell you which one to hold. That's genuinely not what this is for. But I want to point at something the first two explanations have a harder time accounting for, and it isn't a detail in the psalm at all. It's who quoted it. Because whatever the gospel writers did or didn't do with their narratives, there is one line in the crucifixion account that they all seem to have found almost too raw to include. If you were inventing a divine saviour, if your goal was to convince a skeptical ancient world that this executed criminal was the Son of God, the very last thing you would write is that he died screaming that God had abandoned him. That line is an embarrassment. It's a liability. Early critics of Christianity used it as a weapon for centuries. Your own book says he thought God left him, and yet Mark and Matthew preserve it in Aramaic. They kept the actual sound of it, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, and then translated it for their readers as if to say, "We didn't soften this, here's exactly what he said." Which brings us back to the hill. And to the question we've been circling and uncertaining this whole time. If you're following this, and something is turning over in your mind right now, drop a comment and tell me where you are in it. What you think that cry was. I read them, and the conversation in the comments is genuinely half of why this channel exists. A like helps this reach the people who need to see it. Now, let's go back to the cross. Because everything up to this point has been the setup. What comes next is the part that changes the meaning of the entire scene. Here is what almost everyone misses about that moment. In the first century, the Hebrew scriptures were not printed and bound. There were no chapter numbers. There were no verse numbers. Those came more than 1,000 years later. Scrolls were expensive, hand-copied, and largely kept in synagogues rather than homes. So how did people refer to a passage? They quoted it. You said the opening words, and everyone who knew the text knew which text you meant. It was the standard method of citation in a world that lived by memory. The rabbis did it. The gospel writers do it. A single opening phrase functioned the way a title functions for us. And the crowd beneath that cross was not a random assembly of strangers. It was Jerusalem, during Passover. The city was packed with pilgrims. The men mocking him included the religious leadership. Men whose entire lives were built on the memorization of the Hebrew scriptures. Those men knew the Psalms the way you know your own phone number. So when a dying man cried out the first line of Psalm 22, understand what actually happened in the minds of the people who heard it. They didn't hear a scream, they heard a citation. Now, I want to be careful here, and I'd rather be careful than dramatic. There is no line in any gospel that says, and Jesus quoted the psalm in order to direct their attention to it. The text doesn't editorialize. It gives us the words and moves on. So this is interpretation. Christians have made it for centuries, and it's reasonable, but it's an inference, not a stated fact. You should hold it as exactly that. But it's an inference with real weight behind it, because if the intent was simply to express agony, there were 100 ways to do that. If the intent were to cite something, this is precisely how you would do it. And that possibility opens a door, because of what happens next in the psalm. Here's the thing. Most people have heard the first line of Psalm 22 their entire lives and have never read past it. They assume it's a poem about abandonment. It isn't. It's a poem that begins in abandonment, and then it moves. Follow it. The man cries out. He gets no answer. He describes the mockery, the exposure, the bones, the thirst, the men gambling for his clothes. It goes down and down and down, and it keeps going down until you think there's nowhere left for it to go. And then, without warning, the poem turns. For he has not despised or scorned the suffering of the afflicted one. He has not hidden his face from him, but has listened to his cry for help. Read that against the opening line. The psalm opens, "Why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far?" And later the same psalm says, "He has not hidden his face. He listened." That's not a contradiction, that's an arc. The man who wrote it was not describing a God who left. He was describing what it feels like when God is silent, and then describing what he came to understand afterward on the other side of it. And the psalm doesn't stop there. It keeps building. It gets bigger. "I will declare your name to my brothers. In the assembly, I will praise you." Now the sufferer isn't alone anymore. There's an assembly, a community. He's speaking to people. And then it widens again. all the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations will bow down before him. Stop and consider how strange that is. This poem started as one man alone in the dark, convinced God had gone. And it ends with the ends of the earth, every family of every nation, turning toward God. How does a private cry of despair end up talking about the whole world? And it goes further still. The psalm reaches past the living entirely. Posterity will serve him. Future generations will be told about the Lord. They will proclaim his righteousness, declaring to a people yet unborn, he has done it. He has done it. That's how Psalm 22 ends. Not with a plea, with a completed act announced to people who haven't been born yet. And now, hold that next to what John records as one of the last things Jesus said from the cross. It is finished. I'm not going to tell you those are the same words because in the original languages they aren't identical, and I promised you I wouldn't overstate anything. Scholars note the resonance. They don't all agree on how deliberate it is, but the shape is unmistakable. A psalm that begins in God-forsakenness and ends with, he has done it. A crucifixion that begins with, why have you forsaken me, and ends with it is finished. Same starting point, same destination. And that changes what that cry from the cross might have been. Because if he quoted the first line, if the men who knew that text heard the citation and their minds ran forward through the rest of it, the way a mind does when you hear a familiar opening, then what they were hearing was not only a man's despair, they were hearing the beginning of something they already knew the end of. Isaiah, centuries before, wrote about a servant who suffers and is despised and rejected, and whose suffering somehow accomplishes something for others. Psalm 22 is another ancient voice, saying something adjacent but from the inside. Not describing the sufferer from a distance, but speaking in his own voice from within the dark and then walking out the other side. Two texts, different authors, different centuries, pointing in the same direction. But now, I want to leave the historical question for a moment because I think there's something underneath it that matters more. And this part isn't about evidence. Why would a dying man reach for a poem that begins in abandonment? Not a triumphant psalm, not a psalm of victory. There are dozens of those. He could have quoted any of them. He chose the one that starts with the worst thing a human being can feel. That God has gone and isn't coming. Think about who that's for. If you have ever prayed and heard nothing, really prayed in the middle of the night about something that was destroying you and gotten silence back, you know that particular loneliness. And you probably learned somewhere along the way that you weren't supposed to say it out loud. That real faith doesn't ask, why have you forsaken me? That good believers don't accuse God. But the Bible put that accusation in its own songbook. It didn't edit it out, it preserved it, and it handed it to generation after generation, and then, according to the Gospels, the central figure of the entire faith used it as his last coherent sentence. Whatever else that means, it means the cry is not a failure of faith. It's inside the text. It always was. And here is the second half of it, and this is the part I'd ask you not to move past too quickly. Psalm 22 does not answer the question it asks. There's no verse where God explains himself, no moment where the silence gets justified. The man never finds out why. He just, eventually, finds out that he was heard. That God had not hidden his face after all, even in the stretch where it felt exactly like he had. The psalm doesn't say the darkness wasn't real. It says the darkness wasn't the end of the sentence. That's a different kind of comfort than the one most people are offered. It doesn't promise you an explanation. It doesn't promise the suffering was secretly fine. It says you are allowed to say the worst of it out loud, and the saying of it is already in the book, and the book keeps going. If you're in the middle of something right now where God has gone quiet, that's what Psalm 22 is doing there, sitting overlooked between two famous chapters. It was written by a man who was in it, and it was quoted by a man who was in it. Neither of them pretended otherwise. So let's go back one last time. 3 p.m, a hill outside Jerusalem. A man lifts his head and speaks. You've heard those words your whole life. You heard them at the start of this video. Hear them now. My God, why have you forsaken me? An ancient poem existed roughly 1,000 years before that afternoon. We have physical copies of it that predate the crucifixion by generations. Recovered from caves, translated into Greek by Jewish scholars who had never heard of Jesus of Nazareth. Nobody disputes that the text came first. Inside that poem, a righteous man surrounded by mockers who taunt his trust in God and shake their heads. A body poured out, bones out of joint, a mouth dry as broken pottery, hands and feet under a reading that predates Christianity and finds support in a Dead Sea manuscript, pierced. Onlookers staring, strangers dividing his clothes and casting lots while he watches, and a death by public display that would not be invented for centuries. Christians have looked at that and seen the cross. Skeptics have looked at it and seen pattern matching. That argument is real, it's old, and I'm not going to end this by pretending I've settled it for you. But the one thing that isn't argument, the one thing sitting in the plainest possible sight, is that Jesus quoted it. He put that psalm and that cross in the same sentence himself. And so the truth, if it's there, was never hidden somewhere outside the story. It wasn't buried in a lost gospel or a sealed archive or a code that needed cracking. It was in the middle of the Bible, between Psalm 21 and Psalm 23, where anyone could have read it. The words were already there, waiting for someone to read them from beginning to end. So let me leave you with the question, and I want you to actually sit with it before you answer. When he spoke those words from the cross, was that only a man at the end of his strength, crying out the way any of us would? Or was he pointing every person standing there towards something that had been written 1,000 years before they were born? Tell me in the comments. Not just yes or no. Tell me the verse, or the moment, or the detail that changed how you read this. I read every one of them, and the answers people leave on these videos are often better than the video. If this gave you something, a like genuinely helps it reach someone who needs it. And if you want to go further, there's another ancient voice that described a suffering servant centuries before the cross, and it raises questions that are just as hard to put down. That video is on your screen right now. Start it. The text was always there. Go read it.